She picked her wages up from the mud, coin by coin, while the richest man in Willow Creek watched from across the street and said nothing. Every woman in town had dressed their finest to make Ethan Callahan look their way. But he could not take his eyes off the one on her knees in the dirt, the one nobody else bothered to see. That was the summer everything in Willow Creek changed. And it all started the night he saved his first dance for the woman they all looked past. If that already has you feeling something, hit subscribe and follow this story all the way to the end. And drop a comment right now telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far Clara's story travels. The summer of 1882 came to Willow Creek, Montana territory, like it always did, hot, loud, and full of people pretending to be something they weren't. The annual Founders' Day festival had transformed the main street into a carnival of ambition. Ribbons hung from every post. The smell of roasted corn and fresh pie drifted through the air. Fiddle music spilled out of the saloon doors before noon, which meant the whiskey was already doing its job on the men who had nothing better to do than stand around and watch other people work. And in Willow Creek, the most watched man of the entire summer was Ethan Callahan. He was 35 years old, tall in the way that filled a doorframe without trying, with dark brown hair that curled slightly at the collar, and deep brown eyes that didn't miss much. His hands were rough from real work, not the decorative kind of rough that men performed for appearances, but the genuine kind that came from repairing fence lines at first light and pulling cattle out of creek mud in the cold. He had inherited the Callahan Ranch from his father 2 years prior, and what his father had built into something respectable, Ethan had quietly doubled. He was not a man who announced himself, which was precisely why everyone in Willow Creek could not stop watching him. The Beaumont sisters had stationed themselves near the lemonade stand by 9 in the morning. Margaret Holloway, whose father owned the grain mill, had worn her best ivory dress with the pearl buttons, the one she saved for church and funerals. Even old Reverend Tate's niece, who had arrived only 2 weeks ago from St. Louis, with a trunk full of fashionable hats, had managed to position herself directly in the path Ethan would most likely walk. They all wanted the same thing. Not Ethan exactly, or at least not the man behind the name. They wanted the ranch, the land deed, the future that came attached to the Callahan name like a second shadow. Ethan Callahan knew this. He had known it since he was 19 years old, and a girl named Rebecca Sinclair had kissed him behind the feed store, and then the following week asked his father how many acres the family owned. He had learned to read the difference between a woman who looked at his face and a woman who was calculating something behind her eyes. He had stopped looking for warmth in places that only offered transaction. By 10 o'clock he had exchanged polite words with 6 women, tipped his hat to 4 more, accepted 2 slices of pie he didn't particularly want, and maneuvered himself to the far end of the street where the vendor stalls thinned out and the noise dropped to something manageable. That was where he saw her. Not immediately. Not the way stories were supposed to happen, with a shaft of golden light or a sudden stillness in the crowd. He saw her the way a man sees something that doesn't quite fit the picture around it, a detail that pulls at the corner of his attention until he can't pretend it isn't there. She was standing behind a table of ribbon spools and fabric samples at the far edge of the market, arguing quietly with a woman in an expensive green dress. The woman in green had the particular posture of someone who had never once in her life been told no, and had therefore never developed any tolerance for it. The work was shoddy. The woman in green was saying loud enough that the people nearby could hear if they chose to. The hem on the second dress came loose after one wearing Miss Whitfield. I will not pay full price for careless work. The young woman behind the table, Clara Whitfield. Ethan would learn her name within the hour, did not raise her voice. She was perhaps 26, with soft brown hair, pulled back practical and plain, beneath a simple calico bonnet, and she wore the kind of clothes that announced poverty without apology. Her eyes were warm and steady, the color of creek water in summer, and when she spoke with the controlled precision of someone who had learned that anger was a luxury she could not afford. Mrs. Aldridge, she said, I reinforced that hem 3 times before delivery. I would be glad to repair it again at no charge, but I cannot return payment for work that was completed to the terms we agreed on. Margaret Aldridge, wife of Willow Creek's most prosperous merchant, made a sound in her throat that suggested she found the response deeply offensive. "You cannot return it," she repeated, as though tasting the words and finding them bitter. "That is remarkable audacity from someone in your position, Miss Whitfield. Do you have any idea how many women in this town would love to have my business?" "Yes, ma'am," Clara said. "I imagine several of them would. You're welcome to take it to them." The silence that followed that sentence was the kind that had weight. Margaret Aldridge's face went through several colors. The women standing nearby stopped pretending they weren't watching. Two of them exchanged a look that was equal parts alarm and poorly concealed delight. "You ungrateful little—" Mrs. Aldridge stopped herself, drew a breath, and reached into her purse. She pulled out a handful of coins and dropped them onto the table. Not placed. Dropped. Several rolled off the edge and fell into the dirt of the street below. "That is half," she said, "for half the quality I received, and you'll be grateful for that much." She turned and walked away before Clara could respond. Clara stood there for a moment. She looked at the coins on the table. She looked at the ones in the dirt. Her jaw was set, and her eyes were bright with something she was working hard not to let become tears. Then she walked around the table, bent down to the dirt street, and picked up every single coin with both hands. She set them on the table beside the others. She counted them. She wrapped them in a piece of cloth. She tucked the cloth into her apron pocket, and then she looked up, and she looked directly at Ethan Callahan. She had no idea who he was. That much was immediately clear. He could see it in her face, the complete absence of the particular calculation that appeared in women's eyes when they recognized his name. She looked at him the way she might look at any stranger who had witnessed something she'd rather he hadn't, with a brief flicker of dignified irritation, and then she looked away. "Something I can help you with?" she asked, already reaching for a bolt of fabric that needed refolding. "No, ma'am," he said. "Then you're welcome to move along." He almost smiled. "Yes, ma'am." He didn't move along. Not immediately. He stood there another moment watching her organize her table with the focused efficiency of someone who had 20 things to do and had just been handed an interruption she didn't have time for, and he felt something turn over in his chest that he hadn't felt in a very long time. It wasn't attraction exactly. Not yet. It was recognition. The recognition of someone who had also learned at some point to do hard things without asking for applause. He tipped his hat and walked away. He asked about her before lunchtime. He asked Jacob Mercer, who ran the hardware store and knew everything worth knowing about everyone in town, with the particular gift for gossip that men developed when they spent their days behind a counter listening to other men complain. "Clara Whitfield," Jacob said, leaning on the counter with the expression of a man delighted to have something interesting to talk about. "Seamstress. She's been in Willow Creek about 2 years now. Came from a farming family over in Holt County. Father died some business about debts and a disputed land claim real mess. The family lost everything. Brother went north to find work. Mother passed not long after. Clara came here with a sewing kit and about $14 to her name." Ethan listened without comment. "She's good at the work," Jacob continued. "Better than good, actually. But she doesn't exactly make friends easy. Got what some folks call a proud streak. Doesn't take charity. Doesn't accept help from people who make her feel small." He paused. "Makes it hard for her around here. Some people see a woman standing up for herself and they call it arrogance, especially when the woman in question doesn't have money to back it up with." "Mrs. Aldridge paid her half what she was owed," Ethan said. Jacob sighed. "That sounds about right. Margaret Aldridge does that. Picks someone she thinks won't fight back and tests how much she can take. Clara usually fights back." "Good," Ethan said. Jacob looked at him with mild curiosity. "You thinking about something, Ethan?" "Just listening," Ethan said, and paid for the horseshoe nails he'd come in for. The festival continued through the afternoon. Clara sold 3 spools of ribbon, took measurements for 2 new dresses, and repaired a child's torn shirt sleeve on the spot for a woman who couldn't afford to pay, and to whom Clara did not mention that fact. She worked through heat, without complaint, without sitting down, and without once glancing in the direction of the dancing that had started up near the town hall, where all the eligible young women were performing their most charming versions of themselves for the benefit of the men who mattered. At 3 o'clock, Ruth Calloway, who ran the boarding house where Clara rented a small room, appeared at the edge of the stall, looking flushed and excited. "Clara," she said under her breath, "Ethan Callahan has been asking about you." Clara didn't look up from the buttonhole she was stitching. "Has he?" "He asked Jacob Mercer. Jacob told him about your family, and Clara, do you understand what I'm telling you, Ethan Callahan? The Callahan Ranch. He was asking about you specifically." "I heard you, Ruth." "You don't seem appropriately alarmed." "Why would I be alarmed?" Ruth made the sound of someone trying very hard to be patient. "Because men like Ethan Callahan do not ask about women like—" She stopped, reconsidered. "I only mean that it's unusual. He doesn't typically show interest in that. He is very selective about women like me," Clara said. "I didn't say that." "You were going to." Clara finally looked up, and there was no bitterness in her face, just a flat matter-of-factness that was somehow harder to argue with than anger would have been. "Ruth, I appreciate the information. I genuinely do. But whatever Ethan Callahan's reasons are for asking about me, I can tell you right now it isn't anything I want to be involved in. Men with that much money and that much land don't develop curiosity about seamstresses out of the goodness of their hearts. They develop it because they think we'll be grateful for the attention." Ruth opened her mouth, closed it. "What if you're wrong?" "I'm not," Clara said, and went back to her buttonhole. She was of course being unfair. Clara Whitfield knew this. She had known it for years, knew that she painted with a brush too wide, that she assigned guilt to people who hadn't yet earned it, that her history had made her something harder than she might have been if things had gone differently. Her father had been a good man, and still a powerful merchant in Holt County had taken his land through a contract he hadn't understood, and a judge that merchant had in his pocket. Her mother had been kind and trusting, and still the women of their community had turned away when the family fell because poverty was a contagious thing people preferred not to stand near. She had arrived in Willow Creek with $14, and the knowledge settled deep in her bones that the world had a particular way of treating women who needed things from it. She had decided very early on that she would not need anything from it. It was a lonely way to live. She was aware of that. But loneliness was something she could control, and control was the only kind of safety she'd ever been able to afford. She was still thinking about this without quite admitting to herself that she was thinking about it when a shadow fell across her table at 4:30, and she looked up to find Ethan Callahan standing there again. I wasn't doing anything. He wasn't performing charm. He wasn't leaning in with the particular deliberate casualness that men used when they were trying to appear less intentional than they were. He was just standing there with his hat in his hand and an expression on his face that she couldn't immediately categorize. "You again," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "I told you I didn't need help." "You did," he agreed. "I was wondering if you'd take a question anyway." Clara looked at him for a long moment. Long enough that a woman with less composure might have looked away first. Ethan Callahan did not look away. "What's the question?" she said. "Why didn't you fight back with Mrs. Aldridge?" Something shifted in Clara's expression, not softening exactly, but adjusting. "I did fight back." "You let her walk away with half your money." "I let her walk away," Clara said carefully, "because fighting with a woman like Margaret Aldridge in the middle of a street full of people costs more than it wins. She wants me angry. She wants a scene. A scene gives her a story, and a story gives her power over me the next time. I'll keep my money and my dignity, Mr. Callahan," he said. "Ethan," said. She looked at him with new awareness. Not the calculating kind he noted, just the plain kind, the kind that was recalibrating information. "I know who you are," she said. "I figured you didn't." "I was pretending I didn't," she said with a honesty that surprised them both slightly. It seemed like the most efficient way to end the conversation. He almost smiled again. He was doing that a lot around her, almost smiling, as if his face kept approaching something and then catching itself. "I notice it didn't work." "No," she agreed. "It didn't." There was a pause between them that was not entirely uncomfortable. "I heard about what happened," he said. "In Holt County, with your family." Her expression closed immediately, the way a door closes, not slammed, just firmly, finally shut. "Then you heard a version of it," she said. "Not necessarily the true one." "I'd like to hear the true one." "I imagine you would." She began folding a length of cloth with crisp, precise movements. "I imagine most people would. A poor girl's tragedy is very entertaining, Mr. Callahan, especially for people with enough security to watch it from a comfortable distance. That's a harsh way to see things. It's an accurate way." She didn't say it with heat, just with the particular steadiness of someone reporting a fact. "I don't mean any offense. I'm sure you're a perfectly decent man. I'm sure your curiosity is meant kindly. But I've learned that when a man with your kind of name and your kind of position takes an interest in a woman in my position, it rarely ends in anything that benefits the woman." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "That's a fair assessment of men in general," he said. "I won't argue it." She paused in her folding. She looked up. "You're not going to argue?" "No. Most men argue. Most men are trying to convince you of something," he said. "I'm not trying to convince you of anything." "Then what are you doing?" I thought about it honestly, the way he did most things. "I'm not entirely sure," he said. "I saw something this morning that I haven't been able to stop thinking about. And I've learned that when that happens, it's worth paying attention to." Clara stared at him. "I'll let you finish your work," he said. He put his hat back on. "Good evening, Miss Whitfield." He walked away. Clara stood at her table for a long moment after he left, her hands flat on the fabric in front of her, looking at nothing in particular. Ruth materialized at her elbow within 30 seconds. "Well," she demanded. "Well what?" Clara said. "What did he say?" "What did you say, Clara?" "I watched the whole thing, and I could not hear a word." "He asked about Mrs. Aldridge," Clara said. "We spoke briefly. He left. He had his hat in his hand the entire time." "I noticed. Men don't hold their hats for just anyone." "Ruth," Clara said, beginning to pack up her unsold ribbon, "you need to find yourself a more interesting hobby." But that night in her small room at the boarding house, she lay awake longer than usual. The ceiling was the same ceiling it always was. The sounds of the street outside were the same sounds. Nothing had changed. She kept seeing the way he'd looked at her when she said she wasn't sure the true version of her story was the one worth telling. Not with pity. Not with the particular warm condescension that charitable people used when they thought they were helping. With listening. Like someone who understood the difference between a story that had been simplified for other people's comfort and a story that actually happened. She told herself it didn't matter. She fell asleep believing it. Joe. The following Monday. Ethan Callahan walked into the sewing shop. Clara was alone, working at the long table near the front window where the light was best. She heard the bell above the door and looked up from a complicated collar seam, and her expression did something complicated that she controlled before it finished happening. "Mr. Callahan," she said. "Miss Whitfield." He held up a shirt, one of his work shirts with a torn sleeve seam. "I heard you do repairs." She looked at the shirt. She looked at him. "There are 3 other seamstresses in Willow Creek," she said. "I'm aware. The Hendry sisters on 4th Street do excellent work. Mrs. Bloom near the livery is faster." "I don't need faster," he said. "I need good." Clara looked at him for a long moment. Then she stood up, came around the table, and took the shirt from his hands. She examined the torn seam with professional attention, turning the fabric in the light, pressing the frayed edges together to assess how much they had weakened. "It'll hold," she said. "It's not as bad as it looks. 2 hours of work, 30 cents. That's very reasonable." "I know what my work is worth," she said. "I don't discount, and I don't inflate." "Good," he said. "I respect that." She carried the shirt back to her work table. "You can come back Thursday," she said. "It'll be ready." He did not move toward the door. She stopped. "Is there something else?" "There's a shirt that needs mending," he said, "and there's also this." He set a small paper-wrapped parcel on the counter near the door. Mrs. Adkins at the bakery sends these to people who do work she considers exceptional. She mentioned she'd sent you one last spring and you sent it back. Clara's jaw tightened slightly. I don't take charity. It's not charity, he said. It's a transaction between Mrs. Adkins and her own conscience. You did beautiful work on her daughter's wedding dress. She felt she underpaid you. This is her way of correcting that. I was paid the agreed amount. Sometimes the agreed amount is wrong, Ethan said. Sometimes people negotiate poorly and feel bad about it later. Refusing to let them make it right doesn't protect your pride. It just makes them feel worse and leaves you with less than you deserve. The silence was not entirely hostile. That's a very smooth way to argue the same point twice, Clara said finally. I've had practice, he admitted. She looked at the parcel. She looked at him. If I find out this is from you, she said, I'll put it on your doorstep and you'll have to explain to your ranch hands why there's a loaf of bread on the porch at 6 in the morning. It's from Mrs. Adkins, he said. I'll swear to it. She picked up the parcel. She set it on the workbench behind her without opening it. Thursday, she said. For the shirt. Yes, ma'am. He left. Clara stood in the middle of her shop for a moment, looking at the parcel. Then she unwrapped a corner of it and found a small folded note inside, in handwriting. She didn't recognize. That said Miss Whitfield. Your work speaks for itself. It doesn't need to be modest. E.C. She stood there with the note in her hand for a long time. Then she put it in her apron pocket. She told herself it didn't mean anything, but she didn't throw it away. Thursday came, and then the following Monday, and then the Monday after that. Ethan Callahan found reasons to visit the sewing shop with a regularity that did not escape the notice of anyone in Willow Creek. A second shirt, a jacket lining that had pulled loose, a pair of work gloves that needed reinforcing at the seams. None of these repairs required the owner of the largest ranch in the territory to deliver them personally, which was a fact that the women of Willow Creek found absolutely electric with implication. The Beaumont sisters stopped smiling when they saw him walk past their father's store without so much as a glance toward the window. Margaret Holloway, who had worn the ivory dress to the festival specifically to be noticed, wore it again to church the following Sunday and found that Ethan Callahan spent the entirety of the sermon looking at the back of the room where Clara sat in the second-to-last pew. The gossip had a particular texture to it. Not malicious, yet not openly, but building towards something. Willow Creek was the kind of town that tolerated eccentricity in its wealthy men up to a point and called it charming. Past that point, it called it a scandal. Clara was aware of all of this. She was aware in the way that people who have been talked about their entire lives develop a particular sensitivity to the change in temperature when the talk begins. She was also against her better judgment, aware that Ethan Callahan was not what she had decided he was. He did not flatter her. He did not bring her things she hadn't asked for with the single exception of the note, which she still had not thrown away, a fact she chose not to examine too carefully. He sat in the chair near the window while she worked when she let him sit, and he talked to her the way she'd seen men talk to other men directly about things that mattered, without the particular softening performance that men used on women they were trying to impress or manage. He told her about the difficulty of the past winter, when two of his best field hands had left for the railroad camps, and he'd had to renegotiate his spring cattle contracts alone. He told her without embellishment about the specific nature of the grief that had followed his father's death. Not the acceptable public grief, but the complicated private kind, the kind that included anger and guilt alongside the sorrow. She found herself talking back, not immediately, not easily. But gradually, the way a door that has been shut too long begins to open under consistent patient pressure, not forced, not pride, just steadily, gently, persistently, returned to. She told him about the land claim. Not the simple version, not the version she gave people to end the conversation quickly, but the actual version, the contract her father had signed. In good faith, the clause buried 3 pages deep that he hadn't understood the merchant who had brought a judge to the hearing that was supposed to be her family's chance to fight back. She told him about her mother's face in the weeks after the particular way, grief combined with humiliation, to produce something that looked like a woman disappearing from the inside. Ethan listened without interrupting, without offering solutions, without saying, "I'm so sorry," in the reflexive way that people used when they wanted to acknowledge a thing without truly sitting with it. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What was the merchant's name?" She looked at him. "Harlan Deeds." "I know that name," he said. "He operated in 3 counties. He lost a federal case 2 years ago. Land fraud. He's in prison in Helena now." Clara went very still. "I'm not telling you that to fix it," Ethan said quickly. "I know it doesn't fix it. It doesn't give your family back what they lost. I just thought I don't know. I thought you should know that it caught up with him." Clara looked down at the seam she'd been stitching. Her hands had stopped moving at some point without her noticing. "How do you know this?" she asked. "My father dealt with him once," Ethan said. "Early on. When Dad first got the ranch going, Deeds approached him with a proposition that would have given Dad access to more grazing land in exchange for a contract that would have eventually transferred half the ranch's water rights to Deeds Holding Company. Dad brought it to a lawyer. The lawyer told him to walk away." He paused. "I grew up knowing the name because my father used it as a lesson. He said it every time he signed a contract, remember Harlan Deeds. Don't sign what you don't understand." The quiet in the shop had a different quality now. "My father didn't have a lawyer," Clara said. "I know," Ethan said. "I know. It was not absolution. It was not comfort exactly. But it was the particular relief of being seen accurately, not through pity, not through the comfortable distance of someone else's safety, but truly, plainly, honestly seen." Clara Whitfield did not cry. She had not cried in front of another person since she was 17 years old and had made herself a promise on the subject. But she blinked, once, twice. And she looked at this man in the chair by her window, and she thought, "You are not what I decided you were." She wasn't ready to say it out loud, but she thought it. And in the silence between them, she had the distinct and unsettling feeling that he already knew. The note stayed in her apron pocket for 11 days. Clara knew exactly how long because she checked for it every morning without meaning to. Her hand finding the folded paper. The way a tongue finds a sore tooth, automatically, compulsively, before the rest of her mind caught up and reminded her that she had decided it didn't mean anything. On the 12th day, she moved it to the small tin box under her bed, where she kept her mother's wedding ring and the deed to a piece of land that no longer belonged to her family. She told herself that was not the same as keeping it somewhere important. She was becoming very good at lying to herself about Ethan Callahan. The visits had settled into a rhythm that neither of them had formally agreed to. Tuesdays and Thursdays most weeks. Sometimes a Wednesday, if he had business in town, that brought him past the shop. He always knocked, which she appreciated, not because she required the courtesy, but because it told her something about the kind of man he was when nobody was evaluating him. Men who performed good manners for an audience were common enough. Men who performed them when the only audience was a woman who had already made clear she wasn't impressed were considerably rarer. He brought work. That was the arrangement. Always a shirt, a jacket. Something that required stitching, something that gave both of them the plausible structure of a transaction. Clara understood that the work was the architecture of the visits, not the purpose of them, and she suspected he understood this too, and she chose not to say so out loud, because naming a thing changed it. She was not ready for it to change. What she was ready for, she couldn't entirely have said. But she found herself on Tuesday and Thursday mornings choosing which dress to wear with a care she hadn't exercised in years. Not the best dress, she only had 2 that qualified as best, and wearing either one would have announced something she wasn't prepared to announce. But not the most worn-out one either. The middle dress. The blue one with the white collar that Ruth had told her made her eyes look like summer rain. A description Clara had found embarrassingly florid at the time, and now could not stop thinking about. She was aware this was a problem. She was aware in the way a person is aware of a crack in a dam, not in immediate danger. Not yet, but watching it with the focused attention of someone who knows that these things have a tendency to expand when you're not paying close enough attention. The crack expanded on a Wednesday in late July. Ethan came in later than usual, And something was different about the line of his shoulders before she even looked up from the hem she was finishing. She looked up anyway. "You're late," she said. Not an accusation, just a fact. "I had a meeting run long," he said. He sat down in the chair by the window. His chair, she had started thinking of it as his chair, which was another problem she was cataloging for later, and he set his hat on his knee and looked at it instead of at her. Clara put down her work. "What happened?" she said. He glanced up. The expression on his face was one she hadn't seen before. Not the careful steadiness he usually carried, but something under it, something that had gotten through the surface. "My father's lawyer came up from Billings," he said. "Reading of the secondary accounts. Things my father set aside that I wasn't aware of." "Good things or bad things? Complicated things," Ethan said. He turned his hat in his hands. "There are debts, not crippling, but more than I knew about. And a promissory note to a family in Billings the Hargraves that essentially amounts to a pledge of consideration for their daughter." Clara went very still. "Not a legal contract," he said quickly, looking at her. "Not binding. My father made it informally before he got sick at a dinner my parents attended. He told them apparently that he hoped their families might be joined, that he considered it a reasonable future arrangement." He paused. "Eleanor Hargrave is 22. Her family has been operating on the assumption of that promise for 3 years." The shop felt suddenly smaller. "And they've come to collect," Clara said. "Her father is coming to Willow Creek in 2 weeks," Ethan said, "to discuss terms." Clara looked at him for a long moment. "Ethan," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name without the formal address, and they both noticed it, but she kept going rather than acknowledge it. "What do you want me to say right now? Because I can say several things, and I need to know which one you're here for." He looked at her with an expression that was almost grateful. "Tell me what you actually think," he said. "Not what's polite, what you actually think." "I think," she said carefully, "that a promise your father made is not a promise you made. I think that informal pledges between families are not contracts, no matter how long one party has been counting on them. I think that a woman who has spent 3 years assuming a man's hand is already promised to her is going to be hurt when she finds out otherwise, and that will be genuinely sad, and it still won't make it your obligation." She paused. "And I think you already know all of that, and you came here because you needed to hear someone say it plainly." The silence stretched between them, and it had the particular quality of something important. "You're the only person in this town," Ethan said quietly, "who talks to me like I have a functioning mind." "Most people talk to your land," Clara said. "Yes. It's a very large piece of land." Something crossed his face that was the closest thing to a real unguarded smile she'd seen from him. It rearranged his features in a way that was deeply inconvenient for her. "Clara," he said, and then stopped. "Don't," she said. "I haven't said anything yet." "You were going to say something that changes the shape of this." She gestured between them, an imprecise gesture that meant everything she couldn't name precisely. "I'd like to keep it the shape it is for a little longer." He looked at her for a long moment. "All right," he said quietly. "A little longer." He picked up his hat. He stood. He walked to the door, and he paused with his hand on the frame. "The blue dress," he said without turning around. "It's a good choice." He left before she could respond. Clara sat in her shop for a full minute without moving. Then she put her face in her hands and made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite something else. She was in a great deal of trouble. The news that Ethan Callahan was expected to announce an engagement before the summer's end reached the gossip network of Willow Creek with the speed and efficiency of a prairie fire. By Thursday of that same week, it had reached every woman in town who had a stake in the matter, which was effectively every woman in town. By Friday, it had acquired details that nobody could have verified. Eleanor Hargrave was reportedly beautiful, reportedly accomplished on the pianoforte, reportedly the daughter of one of the wealthiest men in Billings. By Saturday, the narrative had solidified into the kind of comfortable certainty that communities developed around stories they found satisfying. Ethan Callahan was going to marry well. Of course he was. Men with his name and his land always did. The summer's eccentricity. Those peculiar visits to the seamstress shop. The hat tipping the conspicuous attention paid to a girl from nowhere would be understood in retrospect as what it obviously was: a wealthy man amusing himself before settling into the serious business of his real life. Clara heard all of this. She heard it first from Ruth, who delivered it with the particular apologetic gentleness of someone braced for a reaction. She heard it again from two women who came into the shop that Friday morning and conducted their conversation about the Hargrave engagement loudly enough to ensure she caught every word which was not accidental. She heard a third version on Saturday when she went to collect thread from the supply merchant, and the merchant's wife offered her a look of such extravagant sympathy that Clara had to work very hard not to say something she couldn't take back. She said nothing. She bought her thread. She walked home, and she sat with it. The careful, honest part of her mind. The part that had kept her functioning through everything that had dismantled her life, told her that she had no right to be hurt. She had not accepted anything from Ethan Callahan. She had not agreed to anything. She had told him explicitly and repeatedly that she did not trust men in his position, that she did not believe their attention came without a cost, that she intended to maintain her independence and her self-sufficiency, and the careful distance she'd constructed between herself and the possibility of being destroyed by another person's choices. She had been very clear about all of this. The problem was that somewhere in the past 7 weeks of Tuesdays and Thursdays and occasional Wednesdays, she had stopped entirely believing it. She had not said so. She had been scrupulous about not saying so. But the note was in the tin box. The blue dress had been worn 9 times. And when she thought about him sitting in the chair by the window, turning his hat in his hands and talking to her, like she had a functioning mind, she felt something in her chest that she'd spent 4 years successfully avoiding. Which meant she had made a catastrophic mistake, and the coldest, most honest part of her mind said, "You knew this was coming. You knew what this was. You just chose not to know it." She did not cry. She pulled the tin box out from under the bed, took out the note, and looked at it for a long time. Then she put it in the small stove in the corner and watched it burn. Ethan came on Tuesday. He knocked. She let him in. She handed him 2 finished pieces: a shirt with a replaced collar, a jacket with relined sleeves, and presented him with the total for both written neatly on a slip of paper, which she slid across the counter to him without meeting his eyes. He looked at the slip of paper. He looked at her. "Clara," he said. "The work is good," she said. "I guarantee the stitching. If anything pulls loose within 30 days, bring it back at no charge. Clara." "I have 3 other pieces waiting," she said. "If there's nothing else you need repaired, I should get back to them." The pause that followed was the kind that had texture. "You heard," he said. "Everybody heard," she said. "It's a small town." "Then you heard something that isn't the whole story." She looked up then, and she made sure her face was the face she had given the world for 4 years. Not cold, not angry, just level. Composed. The face of a woman who was fine, who had always been fine, who was going to continue being fine, regardless of what happened around her. "Mr. Callahan," she said, and she watched him register the formal address, watched something tighten in his jaw. "I think we've both enjoyed a very pleasant few weeks. I think you are genuinely a decent man, more decent than I gave you credit for at the start. I think whatever your father's arrangements were, you'll navigate them thoughtfully and make the right decision for your family and your ranch." She smoothed the front of her apron. "But I think we both knew this was the more realistic outcome, and I'd rather acknowledge it clearly than spend another month pretending otherwise." Ethan set the finished shirts on the counter. "Are you done?" he said. "Excuse me. I want to make sure you're done," he said, "before I say what I'm going to say, because I'd like to say it without interrupting you." Clara looked at him. "I'm done," she said slightly less steadily than she intended. "Good." He put both hands flat on the counter and looked at her with the direct, unhurried attention that had been undoing her careful logic for 7 weeks. "The Hargraves are coming because my father made a gesture at a dinner that my father should not have made. I will meet with them, and I will tell their daughter with every kindness I'm capable of that my father's hopes are not my promises, and that she deserves a man who is actually offering himself, not one who is being assigned to her by a dead man's good intentions. That conversation is going to be difficult, and I'm sorry for the part my family's behavior played in her expectations." He stopped. "That is what is going to happen. I am telling you this, not because I owe you an explanation. We haven't made each other promises either, but because I'd like to be honest with you, since honesty appears to be the only currency you actually trust." Clara's hands were completely still on the counter. "And I'm telling you," he continued quieter, "because the reason I need to have that difficult conversation with the Hargrave family has something to do with the fact that there is a woman who wears a blue dress on Tuesdays and Thursdays, who has been honest with me in ways that nobody else in this town has bothered to try. And I am not prepared to let a dead man's dinner conversation determine what I do about that." The shop was very quiet. "That's a considerable speech," Clara said finally. "I'm generally a man of few words," he said. "I've been saving them up." Something cracked in her chest, not breaking. Not the bad kind, but the kind of cracking that happens when something too tightly held finally releases. She breathed through it. "I burned your note," she said. "I know," he said. "Ruth told me." "Ruth told you?" Clara stopped. "She had no business. She's worried about you," he said. "She's worried you're going to make yourself lonely on principle." Clara looked at him for a long time. "That's not her diagnosis to make." "No," he agreed. "It's yours." The silence was different now. It had stopped being a wall and started being a question. "The Hargraves," she said. "When do they arrive?" 2 weeks from Saturday." "And you'll speak to them clearly?" "Yes." "And after that?" she asked. "After that," he said, "I'd like to have a conversation with you that isn't framed by the exchange of money for tailoring services." He paused. "If you're willing." Clara looked at him for a long, careful moment. She was measuring something, not him exactly, but herself. Measuring how much of the careful distance was genuine wisdom, and how much was just the accumulated weight of other people's betrayals being held against a man who hadn't committed any. "Ask me after that conversation," she said. "Fair enough," he said. He picked up the finished shirts. He put his hat on. He walked to the door and he stopped. "The note," he said. "What it said, it stands whether you burned it or not." He left. Clara stood in the middle of her shop for a very long time. Ruth appeared in the doorway from the back room approximately 4 seconds later, which confirmed that she had been listening from approximately 4 feet away for the better part of the last 20 minutes. "Don't," Clara said before Ruth could speak. "I just don't." Ruth pressed her lips together with visible effort. "Fine," she said, and then, unable to entirely contain herself. "But for what it's worth, I've known Ethan Callahan since he was 17 years old, and in all that time, I have never once heard him make a speech." Clara did not respond, but for the first time in 11 days, she had the sensation of breathing fully. The 2 weeks that followed were the longest of Clara Whitfield's adult life, and they were also unexpectedly busy, which she was grateful for. In the practical way, she was grateful for most things. Ethan did not come to the shop. She had not expected him to had in fact been quietly relieved by it because she needed the distance to think clearly, and thinking clearly in the presence of Ethan Callahan had become increasingly difficult. But his absence was its own kind of presence. She noticed it the way she noticed the change in air pressure before a storm, not quite consciously, not quite not. What she had not expected was the visit from Margaret Aldridge. It came on a Thursday morning, 11 days after the conversation in the shop, and it arrived with the particular deliberate timing of someone who had chosen the moment with care. The shop had been empty for 10 minutes, the last customer had just left, and Clara was alone at the workbench when the bell above the door rang, and she looked up and found Margaret Aldridge standing in the doorway, in an expensive rust-colored dress, carrying herself with the practiced assurance of a woman who had never once walked into a room uncertain of her welcome. "Miss Whitfield," she said. "Mrs. Aldridge." Clara set down her work. She did not stand. "What can I do for you?" Margaret Aldridge moved into the shop with a slow, deliberate walk, looking at the shelves of thread and folded fabric with an expression of mild appraisal. The way a person looks at a place they consider beneath them, but are visiting for a specific purpose. "I'll come directly to the point," Margaret said. "I'd appreciate that," Clara said. "There is talk in this town," Margaret said, turning to face her, "about the nature of Ethan Callahan's visits to your establishment. Talk that has taken on a particular flavor in recent weeks, given the situation with the Hargrave family." She paused for effect. "I think you're a smart enough girl to understand what I'm telling you." "Tell me plainly," Clara said, "and we'll find out." Margaret's eyes narrowed very slightly, the fraction of an inch that polished women allowed themselves instead of the full expression. "You are a seamstress," she said. "You have no family name, no property, no social standing of any kind in this community. Whatever attention Ethan Callahan has been paying you, it is not. It cannot be what you appear to be reading into it. Men like him do not choose women like you, and a woman with any self-respect would recognize that before she becomes the subject of the kind of talk that follows a person for years." Clara looked at her. She thought about her father, who had trusted a man who used language like a weapon and a contract like a trap. She thought about Margaret Aldridge's coins in the dirt. She thought about a note she had burned, and a man who said it stood anyway. "Mrs. Aldridge," she said, and her voice was perfectly even, "you came here to warn me away from something you believe threatens you. I don't know if it's Ethan Callahan specifically, or the idea that a woman in my position might be considered by a man in his, or simply the general principle that things should stay in their assigned places." She stood up. "But I want you to understand something. You dropped my wages in the dirt, and I picked them up. That's not a metaphor. I mean it literally, and I also mean it as exactly the metaphor you think it is." She held Margaret Aldridge's gaze without blinking. "I pick up what's mine. I don't apologize for it. And I don't take counsel from people who've already shown me what they think of me." Margaret stared at her. "Good morning," Clara said. "The door is behind you." For one charged moment, Margaret Aldridge looked like she might say something that would require a response. Then she pressed her lips into a line, turned, and walked out of the shop with the stiff precision of a woman who was furious and had the self-control not to show it completely. The bell rang. The door closed. Clara sat back down. Her hands were shaking very slightly. She put them flat on the work table and pressed down until they stopped. Then she picked up her needle and went back to work. The Hargraves arrived on a Friday, not a Saturday as originally planned, which meant Ethan had less time than he'd thought, and also that the entire town got an extra 24 hours to observe and speculate, which it did with tremendous enthusiasm. Clara heard about the arrival from Ruth, who had heard it from the station master, who had apparently witnessed the whole thing, a well-dressed older couple stepping off the afternoon train, a young woman between them who was by the station master's breathless account. Genuinely lovely dark hair, fine clothes, the kind of composed beauty that suggested good breeding and careful upbringing. Clara received this information while she was hemming a tablecloth, and she kept her eyes on the hem, and she said, "Thank you, Ruth," in a tone that clearly communicated the subject was closed. Ruth, who had been practicing restraint with impressive commitment for the past 2 weeks, managed not to say anything further. That evening, Clara did not sleep. She lay in her narrow bed and looked at the ceiling and conducted a very honest conversation with herself, the kind she'd been avoiding for 2 weeks, the kind that required acknowledging things she'd been carefully refusing to acknowledge. She was afraid. Not of Ethan Callahan, not of the Hargraves, not of Margaret Aldridge's warnings, or the town's talk, or any of the external circumstances she'd spent her adult life learning to navigate. She was afraid of herself specifically, of the version of herself that had started existing again, sometime around the third Tuesday visit, the version that checked the pocket of a blue dress in the morning, and felt something warm when she heard a knock at the shop door. She had buried that version of herself very carefully after her father died. She had buried her along with the belief that the world was interested in fairness, along with the belief that people who hurt you faced consequences, along with the particular kind of hope that had no structural support and was therefore very dangerous. She had not expected it to survive. She had not expected a man to sit in a chair by her window and talk to her about grief. His own grief openly, without the armor that men used, and to listen to her talk about hers without once trying to fix it or minimize it or perform sympathy as a strategy. She pressed her hands over her face in the dark. "You are going to get hurt," she told herself. "You understand that. Whatever happens, you are going to get hurt." She lay there with that for a long time. And then, somewhere around 2 in the morning, she thought maybe being hurt isn't the worst possible outcome. Maybe the worst possible outcome is spending your entire life making sure you can't be. It was not a comfortable thought. It was, however, an honest one. She fell asleep with it, and when she woke up in the morning and reached for the tin box out of habit, out of the muscle memory of 11 days, and found only her mother's ring inside, she held the ring in her palm and thought about the women in her family who had loved impractical things and been both wrecked and sustained by them. And she thought about the person she was trying to be and the person she was possibly actually becoming. And she did not put the ring away immediately. She held it until the morning light shifted. Then she got dressed in the blue dress because it was a Tuesday, and she opened the shop and she waited. He came at noon. Not to the shop. He came around the back, which meant he'd walked through the alley rather than the main street, which meant he'd been thinking about being seen and had decided he didn't want the town watching this particular conversation before it happened. She heard the knock at the back door, and she opened it, and he was standing in the narrow space between her building and the fence, and he looked like a man who had been awake for most of the previous night for approximately the same reasons she had. "How did it go?" she said. "As well as it could," he said. "I spoke to Eleanor privately first. She's gracious, genuinely. She thanked me for being direct. She said she'd had her own doubts but hadn't known how to raise them without disappointing her family." He paused. "Her father is less gracious." "Tell me." "He's threatening to call in the promissory note," Ethan said. "It's not legally binding. My lawyer confirmed that this morning, but he's threatening to make the social consequences significant. To tell people my family broke a gentleman's agreement. To make the kind of noise that follows a family's name." He looked at her steadily. "I want you to know that it doesn't change anything for me. I'm telling you because you deserve to know what I'm walking into, not to ask you for anything about it." Clara looked at him in the doorway of her back entrance in the narrow midday light. "It'll be difficult," she said. "Yes. People will take sides. They already are. And you're still—" She stopped, started again. "You're still sure about what you said in the shop?" "Clara," he said, and the way he said her name had the weight of everything they hadn't said yet. All the Tuesdays and Thursdays, and the note, and the blue dress, and the long, honest conversations about grief and contracts, and fathers who had tried their best and still failed. "I have been sure since the morning of the festival, when you picked your wages up off the dirt, without looking at anyone for permission." She breathed. "The Hargraves are still in town," she said. "You should go back." "I know. And when they leave," he said, "I'm going to come to the front door, in full view of the street, and I'm going to ask if you'd like to take a walk." She looked at him for a long moment. "I might say no," she said. "I know that too," he said. "I'll ask anyway." He put his hat on. He walked back through the alley. Clara stood in the doorway for a long time after he disappeared around the corner, her hand on the doorframe, the afternoon settling around her like something deciding to stay. She was afraid. She was also, for the first time in 4 years, something else. She couldn't name it yet. But it felt cautiously, and against all of her accumulated wisdom, like the beginning of something she was no longer entirely sure she wanted to refuse. The Hargraves left on a Monday. Clara knew because she heard the wagon pass the shop at 7:30 in the morning, heard it without seeing it, recognized the particular weight of a departure in the way the sound moved down the street and didn't come back. She was at the workbench with a half-finished sleeve in her hands, and she set it down and looked at the front door and waited for something she couldn't name. Nothing came that morning. Nothing came that afternoon. By evening, she had finished 3 pieces of work she'd been putting off for a week, reorganized her thread by color and weight, with a thoroughness that Ruth would have called obsessive, and eaten supper alone in her room with a book she read the same page of 4 times without retaining a word. Tuesday came. She wore the blue dress. She was not going to think about the fact that she wore the blue dress. At 11 o'clock, someone knocked at the front door. Not the back door. The front door. in full view of the street. Clara set down her needle. She smoothed the front of her apron with both hands. She walked to the door and opened it, and Ethan Callahan was standing on the step with his hat in his hand and the particular expression of a man who had made a decision and was standing in it completely. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. "I was wondering," he said, "if you'd like to take a walk." Clara looked at him. She looked past him at the street where Mrs. Hennessy from the dry goods store had already stopped sweeping her step to watch, and where two women she recognized from the church auxiliary were standing close enough together to be sharing one conversation instead of two. She looked back at Ethan. "Give me a moment," she said. "I need to put the iron down." She went inside. She put the iron down. She untied her apron. She hung it on the hook by the workbench, and she breathed once steadily all the way through. Then she walked back to the door and stepped out into the street beside him. She did not take his arm. She was not ready for that. But she walked beside him, and he matched her pace without comment, and they went down the main street of Willow Creek together in the late morning light, while every person who happened to be looking found a reason to keep looking. "How is Eleanor?" Clara asked, because it was the question she was actually thinking about, and she had decided sometime in the past 2 weeks that she was finished with the practice of asking different questions than the ones she meant. "She's well," he said. "She wrote to me this morning, actually. She's visiting a cousin in Billings before they return home. She sounded lighter, I think is the word, like someone who'd been holding their breath and finally let it go." "And her father? Still unhappy," Ethan said. "He'll be unhappy for a while. That's his right." He paused. "He also, it turns out, has no legal ground whatsoever. My lawyer was very clear on that point." Clara nodded. She thought about her own father and the judge that Harlan Deeds had in his pocket, and the difference between a man who could afford a very good lawyer and a man who couldn't afford one at all. She did not say this, but she filed it the way she filed most things in the part of her mind that kept track of the ways the world's fairness was distributed unevenly. "There will be talk," she said. "There's already talk," he said. "More talk, worse talk. Probably," he agreed. He glanced at her sideways. "Does that change your answer?" Clara thought about Margaret Aldridge's coins in the dirt. She thought about the women from the church auxiliary still watching from the corner. She thought about 4 years of building a life on the principle that needing nothing from anyone was the only form of safety available to a woman in her position. "No," she said. He didn't smile, not quite. But something in his face settled like a thing that had been braced for impact and found none. They walked to the end of the street and back, and it took 20 minutes, and by the time they returned to the shop door, Clara was aware that she had just performed in full view of Willow Creek the most public act of her private life since she had arrived in this town with $14 and a sewing kit. She was also underneath the anxiety of it surprised to find that she was not sorry. "Thursday," he said at the door. "Thursday," she said. What happened next was not a fairy tale. Clara had lived long enough to be suspicious of fairy tales, and Ethan Callahan, for all his considerable virtues, was no prince from a story. He was a man with a ranch that was more complicated than it looked from the outside, a family legacy that came with obligations attached, and a community that had very specific expectations of what his life was supposed to look like. The talk that came was as predicted worse. Not all of it was malicious. Some of it was the ordinary human compulsion to make sense of things that disrupted established patterns. But enough of it was malicious to be notable, and it was delivered with the particular efficiency of a small town that had decided on an explanation and was now distributing it widely. The Beaumont girls told anyone who would listen that Clara Whitfield had been engineering Ethan's visits to the shop from the beginning. Margaret Aldridge, whose own visit to the shop had apparently not gone the way she intended, allowed it to be known through appropriately indirect channels that she had serious concerns about the character of a woman who had reportedly chased off a perfectly suitable young lady from a fine Billings family. And from somewhere, Clara never identified the precise origin point. A version of her family's story began circulating that bore a specific resemblance to the truth, while inverted at every crucial moral point. In this version, her father had been a man of questionable character. The land dispute had been his own fault, and Clara's departure from Holt County had been less an escape from ruin than a flight from consequences. Clara heard all of it. She heard it because she lived in Willow Creek, and that was how Willow Creek worked, and she chose to walk through it the same way she had walked through everything else, not without feeling it, but without letting it change her direction. What she had not fully anticipated was how it would feel to watch Ethan walk through it alongside her. He did not hide the association. He did not take the easy path that would have been available to a man of his standing. A careful reduction in the frequency of visits. A return to the polite but distant posture that everyone would have understood and accepted as a return to good sense. He came on Tuesdays and Thursdays. He walked with her on Sunday afternoons when his work allowed. He attended the church service where she sat in the second-to-last pew, and he sat in his family's traditional pew at the front, and he turned his head at one point to look back at her, and everyone in the room saw him do it, and nobody missed what it meant. She understood what this cost him. She understood it in the precise way that people who have paid social costs themselves understood the mechanism, the way a community's approval could be withdrawn in increments so small, each one was almost deniable until you looked up one day and found yourself standing in a different kind of cold. She brought it up directly one Thursday in late August because she was a woman who brought things up directly. "Your foreman came into the shop this morning," she said. Ethan was sitting in his chair, a cup of coffee she'd made him going cold on the windowsill because he kept forgetting to drink it. Holt. He wanted new work gloves. He was also, she chose her words. He was friendly enough, but he said something as he was leaving. What did he say? He said he hoped things would settle down for you soon. She looked at Ethan steadily. The way he said it suggested that things have been unsettled for a while. Ethan picked up the coffee and drank some of it. Holt worries, he said. Holt is right to worry, Clara said. You have business relationships in this county that depend on people respecting your name. You have hands to pay and contracts to meet. I am not. I need you to hear me when I say this. I am not so completely recovered from my own principles that I'm willing to pretend that your association with me has no practical consequences. He looked at her for a long moment. Are you telling me to stop coming here? I'm asking you to think about whether it's worth it, she said. Plainly, without the speech. Without the speech, he repeated. Yes. He set the coffee down. He leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, and he looked at her with the expression she had come to associate with the moments when he was about to say something that was going to rearrange the furniture of her thinking. My father, he said, spent 15 years making decisions based on what the county would think of him. He made a promise to a family in Billings at a dinner table because it was the kind of promise that was expected of a man in his position. He accepted contracts he had doubts about because refusing would have caused awkwardness. He managed his reputation like a second business, always profitable, always tidy. He paused. He was also, in the last 2 years of his life, one of the loneliest men I have ever been close to. He told me once, 6 weeks before he died, that he couldn't remember the last time he'd made a decision purely because it was what he wanted. Clara was quiet. I am not my father, Ethan said. I loved him, but I am not going to live his version of things and arrive at the end of it with a ranch that runs well and a life that doesn't. He met her eyes. So to answer your question, yes, it's worth it. That's not a speech. That's just the answer. Clara looked at him. Holt is still right to worry, she said. Holt is paid to worry about cattle, Ethan said. I'll handle the rest. She almost smiled. Almost. Drink your coffee, she said. It's getting cold again. The annual Founders Day Ranch Auction was held in the first week of September, and it was the largest social event in Willow Creek outside of the festival itself. Every rancher in a 50-mile radius came to bid on livestock and equipment, and to conduct the particular business that happened in the margins of official events, in conversations between men who trusted each other enough to speak plainly outside of formal settings. Ethan had attended every year since he was old enough to stand beside his father and learn the difference between a bid made from confidence and a bid made from desperation. This year, he came alone. Clara had not planned to attend. She had no reason to attend an auction, she had nothing to buy and nothing to sell, and the event took place in the broad square outside the town hall, where every interaction would be visible to approximately 200 people. She had in fact specifically decided not to attend on those grounds. She was there by 10 o'clock because Ruth had pointed out with characteristic directness that not attending would look like hiding, and Clara Whitfield had not hidden from anything in 4 years and was not going to start now. The morning was loud and crowded and smelled of horses and sawdust and the particular collective energy of a community engaged in the performance of its own prosperity. Clara positioned herself near the eastern edge of the square, where the fabric merchant had set up a secondary stall, and where she had a plausible reason to be that didn't require explaining. She saw Ethan on the far side of the square within 10 minutes. He was talking to 2 older ranchers she didn't know, and he had his hat on and his arms crossed and the expression of a man conducting business efficiently. He hadn't seen her yet. What she noticed watching him from across the crowded square was the way the men around him deferred to him, not with the excessive performance of people deferring to money, but with the quieter respect that came from genuine professional regard. He spoke, and they listened. He asked a question, and they answered it honestly, without the particular verbal decoration people added when they were trying to impress someone. Whatever the talk about his personal choices had cost him in some quarters, it had not apparently cost him this. She was still watching when Margaret Aldridge materialized at her elbow. Clara did not startle because she had spent 4 years developing the habit of being aware of her surroundings, but it was closer to a startle than she would have preferred. "Miss Whitfield," Margaret said, "I wasn't expecting to see you here." "Mrs. Aldridge," Clara said. Margaret was impeccably dressed as always, in a deep blue that probably cost more than Clara earned in 2 months. She had 2 women with her, the Sinclair sisters, who ran the millinery and who orbited Margaret Aldridge with the loyalty of planets around a sun that was somewhat too hot for comfort. "I wanted to speak with you," Margaret said in the tone of someone who had prepared for this conversation. "I think our last exchange ended rather abruptly." "I thought it ended clearly," Clara said. "I was trying to warn you," Margaret said, "for your own benefit." "Mrs. Aldridge." Clara kept her voice level, quiet, not designed to carry. "You came to my shop and told me that women in my position don't get chosen by men in his position. I heard you. I considered what you said. And I concluded with respect that you were trying to protect your own version of how things should be arranged and using concern for me as the delivery method." She held Margaret's gaze without any particular hostility, just steadiness. "I don't think you're a bad person. I think you are a person who believes the world has a correct order and gets frightened when it shows signs of rearranging itself. That's a very human thing to feel. But it's not my job to maintain the arrangement for you." The Sinclair sisters exchanged a look. Margaret Aldridge's expression went through something complicated. For a moment, just a moment, Clara thought she saw something underneath the composure that was less like malice and more like a woman who had made a very long series of strategic decisions and occasionally wondered what it would have felt like to make different ones. Then the composure reassembled. "You're very sure of yourself," Margaret said. "I'm sure of a few things," Clara said. "I'm sure I pick up what's mine. I'm sure I don't discount my own worth for anyone's convenience. And I'm sure that whatever happens, I can live with the choices I make." She paused. "Can you say the same?" It was perhaps too direct. She knew it as she said it, felt the edge of it, the way it cut closer than was strictly necessary. But she had spent 4 years being the person who absorbed other people's cruelties with composed silence, and she found standing in this crowded square in the September heat that she was no longer willing to absorb this one. Margaret said nothing. She turned and walked away, the Sinclair sisters falling into formation behind her. Clara let out a slow breath. She turned back toward the auction square and found that Ethan Callahan was standing 20 feet away, completely still, looking directly at her. He had crossed the square at some point in the previous few minutes, and from the angle of his position, she understood with a cold precision that he had heard at least part of the conversation. She waited for what his face would do. What it did was something she hadn't expected. He looked at her, the way someone looks at a thing they have been trying to see clearly for a long time and have finally fully seen. Not with surprise. With a kind of arriving the expression of a man who has been traveling towards something and has just understood exactly where he is. He walked toward her. She didn't move. He stopped in front of her, and they were in the middle of the Founders' Day auction with 200 people within earshot. And he looked at her and said quietly enough that only she could hear it, "Are you all right?" "Yes," she said. And then, because he had asked her to tell him what she actually thought, "I may have been somewhat more direct than the situation required." "You were exactly as direct as the situation required," he said. "You heard most of it." He held her gaze. "Clara, I need to tell you something. And I need to tell it to you here in this square in front of however many people are currently watching, because I am finished with the version of this where I let other people set the terms of what I'm allowed to show." She went very still. "Ethan, I'm in love with you," he said, simply, completely, without the architecture of circumspection around it. "I've been working up to saying it plainly for weeks, and I've decided that waiting for the perfect moment is just another form of letting other people decide when I get to live my own life." He paused. "I'm not asking you to say it back. I'm not asking you for anything right now. I just needed you to know it as a fact stated clearly with no hedging." The square continued around them. The auctioneer's voice carried across the crowd. 2 horses changed hands somewhere to the left. The world conducted its business with complete indifference to the fact that Clara Whitfield was standing in the middle of it with something cracking open in her chest that she had spent 4 years learning to prevent. She opened her mouth. She closed it. She looked at this man, this steady, patient, plain-spoken man who had sat in her shop chair and talked to her about grief and contracts and the lonely way his father had lived, and she felt the last of the carefully constructed distance collapse inward like a fence in a flood. She was going to cry. She was absolutely not going to cry in the middle of the Founders' Day auction in front of 200 people. She breathed. "That is a considerable thing to say out loud," she managed. "I know," he said. "I meant every word of it." "In front of—" She glanced sideways at the crowd, several members of which were no longer pretending not to watch. "In front of all of these people." "All of these people," he confirmed. "I'll say it again if it would help." "It would not help," she said with a precision that made something in his face do the thing it did, the almost smile, but closer to actual than she'd ever seen it. "Ethan." She said his name, and it had the weight of everything she hadn't been ready to say until this moment. The Tuesdays and the Thursdays, and the note in the tin box, and the blue dress, and the long, honest conversations that had taken the wall apart, one carefully placed word at a time. "I need you to understand something about me. Tell me." I am not easy," she said. "I don't trust quickly, and I don't forgive quickly, and I have opinions about every single thing, and I will always tell you what I actually think, even when it's not what you want to hear. I keep accounts. I pick up my own wages out of the dirt. I do not perform gratitude for things I haven't asked for, and I do not perform helplessness to make anyone feel useful." She looked at him very directly. I am not the soft landing that this town thinks a man in your position deserves." "No," he agreed. "You're better than that." She stared at him. "I don't need a soft landing," he said. "I need someone who tells me the truth. I have enough people in my life who tell me what they think I want to hear. They are not useful. They are comfortable, and I have found that comfortable is frequently the opposite of honest." He held her gaze. "I want the person who tells me what she actually thinks. I want the person who keeps accounts and picks wages up from the dirt and has opinions about every single thing. I want you, Clara, the complete version. I am not interested in a reduced one." In the crowd, someone had noticed that Ethan Callahan and Clara Whitfield were standing very close together in the middle of the auction square, and the noticing was spreading outward in the quiet, incremental way that community attention spread when something significant was happening, and everyone understood that it was significant. Margaret Aldridge had turned back and was watching from a distance with an expression that was unreadable. Ruth Calloway, who had spotted Clara from across the square and had been working her way through the crowd toward her, for the past 5 minutes, stopped when she saw what was happening and pressed both hands over her mouth. Clara Whitfield, who had arrived in Willow Creek with $14 and a conviction that the world would use her if she let it, who had built her safety out of self-sufficiency and principled distance and the careful management of everything she allowed herself to need. Clara Whitfield looked at the man in front of her, and felt in the most inconvenient and complete way that all of those careful constructions had been built to survive a world that she was no longer entirely sure she needed to survive alone. She was afraid. She was absolutely afraid. She was also underneath it more certain than she had been of anything since she left Holt County. "Ask me again," she said. He understood immediately. "Would you like to take a walk, Miss Whitfield?" "Yes," she said. "I would." He offered her his arm. Not the performative gesture she'd seen men use in parlors, but the simple practical offer of a man who wanted to be alongside her in something real. She took it. And they walked together through the crowd at the Founders' Day auction, while 200 people watched, and the auctioneer called bids, and the world continued turning on its indifferent axis. But here is what Willow Creek would talk about for years afterward. Not the walk itself, which lasted only to the far edge of the square and back, but what happened when they reached the edge and turned around and found Margaret Aldridge standing directly in their path. She was alone this time. No Sinclair sisters, no armor of accompaniment. She looked at Ethan, and then she looked at Clara, and then she looked at both of them together. The arm, the proximity, the unmistakable fact of a choice publicly made, and something in her face shifted. Not collapsing exactly. More like a woman standing in a breeze, feeling it change direction and choosing slowly to face it. "Mr. Callahan," she said. "Mrs. Aldridge," he said. His voice was civil. His posture left no ambiguity. She looked at Clara. Her chin lifted. Her jaw was tight. And then she said in the quietest voice Clara had ever heard from her, "You should know that the dress you made for my daughter's birthday, the green silk she wore it to every significant occasion last season. She said it was the best constructed garment she owned." A pause. The chin lifted another fraction of an inch. "I paid you half of what it was worth." Clara looked at her. "Yes," she said. "You did." Margaret reached into her purse. She counted out coins, not dropped, not scattered, but placed deliberately one by one into Clara's open hand. The exact amount that had rolled into the dirt that July morning, and then several more beyond it. "The rest," Margaret said tightly, "is for the inconvenience." She turned and walked away. Clara stood in the middle of the auction square with the coins in her hand, and this time, just this once, she let Ethan Callahan see the expression she kept off her face for everyone else. The one that was not composed. The one that was full of the particular complicated emotion of receiving something you'd earned so long after the fact that you'd stopped believing it was coming. He didn't say anything. He didn't offer a commentary on what it meant or what she should feel about it. He just stood beside her while she felt it. That she thought that specific quality of companionship, the kind that knew the difference between the moments that needed words and the moments that only needed a person to stay present, was perhaps the most unexpected thing he had given her. When she was ready, she looked up. "I need to get back to the shop," she said. "I'll walk you," he said. "The whole town is going to watch." "I know," he said. "I'm counting on it." She closed her fingers around the coins. She squared her shoulders. And she walked back through the crowd of Willow Creek with Ethan Callahan beside her. Not behind her. Not ahead of her. Beside her at exactly the same pace, as if they'd been going the same direction for much longer than one summer's worth of Tuesdays and Thursdays. Behind them the auction continued. The bids went up and came down. Horses were bought and sold and led away. And somewhere in the crowd, Ruth Calloway was telling the woman next to her very quietly, and with tremendous satisfaction, that she had known from the moment she saw that man hold his hat in his hands. The walk back through the auction crowd took 11 minutes. Clara counted them without meaning to, the way she counted most things automatically. Precisely the habit of a woman who had learned that paying attention to details was the only reliable protection against being surprised by them. 11 minutes of people watching, of conversations, pausing as they passed, of the particular quality of silence that falls over a community. In the moment, it understands that something has changed and is deciding how to feel about it. Ethan walked beside her with the steady, unhurried manner of a man who had made his decision and was not interested in defending it. He did not perform confidence. He simply had it the way people had things they'd earned rather than constructed. And Clara found that this more than anything was what settled the anxious part of her that kept expecting the ground to shift. He left her at the shop door with a simple, "Thursday," and she said, "Thursday," and she went inside and stood in the middle of her workroom for a long moment before she did anything else. She was engaged. Not formally, he hadn't asked formally yet, and she hadn't formally said yes to anything beyond a walk. But they were both practical people, and they both understood that what had happened in the auction square was not something that reversed itself. It was a declaration made publicly, with all the social weight that declarations in small towns carried. She sat down at the workbench. She picked up her needle. She thought, "I am going to need a larger shop." It was the most Clara Whitfield thought she'd ever had, and it made her laugh out loud alone in her workroom for the first time in longer than she could remember. The proposal came on a Thursday evening, which was appropriate. He had finished his coffee finally for once before it went cold, and she had finished the buttonholes on a dress that had been waiting for 2 days, and they had talked about the price of cattle feed and the leaking roof on the church hall, and whether the new school teacher from Ohio would last the winter or find the territory too much for her, and the conversation had the comfortable ranging quality of two people who had stopped performing ease and simply had it. Then Ethan set down his cup, and Clara looked up from the last buttonhole, and she could see immediately from his expression that the register had shifted. "Clara," he said. "Yes," she said. Not as an answer to anything he'd asked yet. Just as an acknowledgement that she was listening, that she was present, that whatever he was about to say had a ready audience. He reached into his jacket pocket and set something on the workbench between them. A ring. Plain gold, narrow and well made, with a small oval stone the color of creek water. "It was my mother's," he said. "She left it to me specifically. She told me the year before she died that I should give it to someone who would wear it honestly and not for appearances." He paused. "She would have liked you." She had the same way of saying exactly what she thought without making it feel like a weapon. Clara looked at the ring. She did not pick it up yet. "You understand what you're asking," she said. It was not a question. "I understand completely," he said. "I'm asking you to marry me knowing that you're not going to rearrange yourself to fit my life. I'm asking because I want to build something that fits both of us, and I'm smart enough to know I need a better partner than my own instincts to do it." He held her gaze. "I'm asking because I love you. I said it in the auction square, and I mean it here, and I'll mean it in 30 years, and I'd like to start the 30 years as soon as you're willing." Clara looked at the ring for a long moment. Then she picked it up. She turned it in the light. She examined the setting with the professional attention she gave. Everything made by someone's hands. The quality of the work. The years it had survived the weight of it in her palm. "It's beautifully made," she said. "Yes," he agreed. She looked at him. "There are things we need to agree on first." "Tell me," he said. Not sighing it, not bracing for it, just asking, the way he always asked. "I'm keeping the shop," she said. "I'm not a decoration, and I'm not a retirement. I work, and the work matters to me, and that doesn't change because I move from one building to another." "I know," he said. "I'd expect nothing else. The women I've been informally helping, the ones who can't pay full price, I intend to formalize that. Find a way to make it sustainable. Not charity. A proper arrangement." "What kind of arrangement?" "I haven't figured out all of it yet," she said. "But I will. I'll need your opinion on the business structure, not your permission." "Understood," he said. "What else?" "Your foreman," she said. "Holt. He needs to know from you directly, not from rumor, not from inference, that his concerns about your choices are heard, and also that they don't govern you. He's a good man. I don't want him to feel undermined. But I also won't spend the next 30 years in a house where the staff treats me as a temporary inconvenience waiting to be corrected." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "I'll talk to Holt this week," he said. "I mean it as a conversation, not a decree," she said. "I want him to understand why, not just what." "That's a fairer approach than most people would take," he said. "I'm not interested in winning over people through authority," she said. "I'm interested in winning them over through being someone worth respecting. Those are different things, and they require different methods." She set the ring down on the workbench between them again. "And I need to go to Holt County." He looked at her. "Before we marry," she said. I need to go back. There's a property issue, a small one related to my father's estate, that I've been putting off dealing with because I couldn't afford the travel, and because I wasn't sure I was ready." She held his gaze. "I'm ready now. And there's a man there, a lawyer named Prescott, who helped my father in the early days before things went wrong, who I think might have documented some of the original terms of my father's land agreement. If that documentation still exists, it might not undo what Harlan Deeds did, but it might correct the public record. My father's name has a version on it that isn't true. I want to address that." The quiet in the shop had the quality of something important being understood. "I'll come with you," Ethan said. "You have a ranch to run." "I have a foreman to run it for 2 weeks," he said. "I'm coming with you." She looked for a long moment. She thought about 4 years of doing every single hard thing alone, by principle, by necessity, by the deep structural conviction that depending on anyone was the same as handing them a lever that would eventually be used against her. She thought about a man who sat in a chair by her window and talked about grief. "All right," she said. She picked up the ring. She put it on. It fit. She looked at it on her hand for a moment, with an expression she didn't try to control. "Thursday," she said, which was not what she meant at all. "Thursday," he said, which meant, I know exactly what you mean." They left for Holt County on a Tuesday morning 2 weeks later, which pleased Clara in the obscure way that symmetry pleased her. Beginning the next chapter on the same day of the week that the story had quietly started. Ruth saw them off at the station, with the expression of a woman who was trying not to make a scene, and not entirely succeeding. She embraced Clara with a ferocity that said everything she was too composed to say out loud, and when she pulled back, her eyes were bright, and her chin was up, and she said, "Write me as soon as you know anything." "I'll write," Clara said. "And eat properly," Ruth added. "You don't eat enough when you're thinking about something." "Ruth, I'm not wrong, and you know it." Clara, who did in fact stop eating properly when she was working through a problem, said nothing. She picked up her bag and boarded the train. Ethan was already in the car, having managed the luggage with the efficient practicality of a man accustomed to getting things from one place to another without drama. He stood when she entered, and waited until she'd chosen her seat. She took the window, always the window, and then sat across from her, and the train moved, and Willow Creek receded behind them. She watched it go. She was aware of the precise feeling in her chest as the town disappeared. Not relief, not grief, but the particular specific sensation of carrying something into new territory and not yet knowing what it would weigh when you arrived. "Tell me about Prescott," Ethan said. She turned from this window. "He was a small practice lawyer, worked out of an office above the hardware store in Millfield. He prepared the original deed documentation for my father when my family first settled on the land before Harlan Deeds was involved. He was the one who told my father the initial settlement was legitimate." She paused. "He also tried to help us when the dispute began. He was the one who identified the buried clause, who saw what Deeds had done. But by then, Deeds had the judge, and Prescott was a one-man practice with no political backing, and there was nothing he could do." She looked at her hands. "He wrote to me after. After my father died, after my mother, he wrote, and said he was sorry, and that the documentation from the original filing was still in his records if it was ever needed." "Did he expect you'd need it?" "I think he expected I'd want it," she said. "Someday, for the record." Ethan nodded. "And the rest of it, being back there?" She understood what he was asking. "Hard," she said. "Probably. I haven't been back since I left. The town has a version of my family's story that I've been living with at a distance. Being in the same room with it will be different." "You don't have to do anything you don't want to do," he said. "I know," she said. "That's not the same as saying I should avoid the things that are difficult." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." The train moved through the territory with the particular unhurried momentum of something that had a schedule and intended to keep it. And Clara sat with her hands in her lap and the ring on her finger catching occasional light, and for the first time in a very long time, she allowed herself to simply be somewhere in transit, not yet arrived without needing to have the next thing already solved. It lasted approximately 40 minutes before she started mentally drafting the letter she would send to Lawyer Prescott upon arrival. Ethan watched her do it, watched her face go through the focused, sequential expression of someone organizing an argument, and said nothing. And when she caught him watching, he did not pretend he hadn't been. "I'm planning," she said. "I know," he said. "You do that thing with your jaw." "What thing with my jaw?" "You press it together slightly," he said. "When you're working something through. You've done it every time you're solving a problem since the second Tuesday I came to the shop." Clara stared at him. "You've been cataloging my jaw." "I've been cataloging everything," he said with complete unapologetic honesty. "You're interesting. I pay attention to interesting things." She turned back to the window because she was not going to smile about that in a way he could see. She smiled anyway. Millfield was smaller than she remembered. That was the first thing that struck her. Stepping off the train with Ethan beside her, the way the town had contracted in her memory, from something large and weighty into something ordinary and provincial. A collection of buildings and dusty streets that had once contained the entirety of her world, and now looked like what it was, a small place in a large territory, where small people had made large decisions that had changed her family's life. Not because they were powerful in any absolute sense, but because nobody had been powerful enough to stop them. She breathed through it. Ethan didn't say anything. He carried both bags and walked beside her and left the space around her undisturbed, which was exactly right. Prescott's office was still above the hardware store. The stairs creaked in the same places. The door had the same brass plate with the same slight tarnish at the lower left corner. She knocked. The man who opened the door was older than she remembered. 10 years of difficult practice had aged him considerably, but his eyes were sharp, and when he saw her, his expression did something immediate and unguarded. "Miss Whitfield," he said. He looked at Ethan. He looked at her hand. He looked back at her face. "Come in. Please come in." The office was the organized chaos of a man who knew where everything was and could not explain the system to anyone else. He cleared papers from 2 chairs and gestured them to sit, and he sat across from them and looked at her with the expression of a man who had been carrying a debt for a long time. "I hoped you'd come," he said. "I kept the files." "All of them," she said. "Everything from the original filing," he said. "And—" he stopped, pulled a breath. "Miss Whitfield, there's something I should have done years ago and didn't. I want to address that before we discuss the documents." She waited. "I had more than the original filings," he said. "After your father's case was lost, after Deeds had the land transferred. I found something, in the county records, a prior transaction that Deeds had conducted in another county, almost identical to your father's case, where he'd used the same buried clause technique. The judge in that case had flagged it as potentially fraudulent. It was never prosecuted. Deeds had already moved on, and the other family had accepted the outcome, but the record existed." Clara went very still. "I had that record," Prescott said, "approximately 6 weeks before your father died. I was preparing to bring it to the federal circuit. It would not have reversed the land transfer, the legal pathway for that was already closed, but it might have changed the public record. It might have led to an earlier federal investigation. It would have at least given your family the documented acknowledgement that they were defrauded and not simply careless." He looked at his hands. "I didn't file it. My practice was small. Deeds still had influence in the county. I was afraid of what fighting him directly would cost me." A long pause. "Your father died before I found my nerve. By the time the federal case was built against Deeds 2 years later, I had the documentation ready. I provided it anonymously, and I have been ashamed of that word anonymously every day since." The office was very quiet. Clara sat with what he'd said and let it sit with her. She felt Ethan's complete stillness beside her, not rigid, not tense, just entirely present in the way he was when he understood that something required witness rather than response. "Mr. Prescott," she said finally. Her voice was even, carefully even. "If you had filed it, would it have saved my father's land?" "No," he said. "Probably not." "Would it have saved his life?" Prescott closed his eyes. "I don't know." "Then I am not going to tell you that it doesn't matter," she said. "Because it does matter. What you did or didn't do mattered. My father spent the last months of his life believing he had failed his family through carelessness, and the correct record might have given him something different to believe about himself. That is a real thing that happened, and I'm not going to smooth it over." She held his gaze. "But I also know what fear costs a person. I know what it feels like to understand the right action and stand in the gap between understanding and doing it, and I know that people who have never been in that gap don't understand how large it actually is." She paused. "I'm not here to punish you. I'm here for the documentation. And I'm here because my father's name still has a false version on it in this county, and I intend to correct it." Prescott opened his eyes. They were wet. "I have everything you need," he said. The meeting with the county recorder's office took 4 hours, and the sustained, focused attention of Ethan's Billings lawyer, who had traveled down to meet them, and Prescott, who provided 12 years of archived documentation, with the precise, organized efficiency of a man who had been keeping those files ready and waiting for exactly this moment. What emerged from those 4 hours was not a reversal. The land was gone, legally transferred, legitimately sold after the transfer, now in its third ownership. There was no pathway to recovery, and Clara had not come expecting one. What emerged was a formal amendment to the county record, documenting that the original land transfer had been achieved through a fraudulent contract technique that its executor, Harlan Deeds, now serving a federal sentence in Helena, had used systematically across 4 counties. The amendment recorded that the Whitfield family's loss of the land had been the result of fraud and not negligence. It recorded that the original settlement had been legitimate and properly filed. It placed on the permanent record that Thomas Whitfield had been a man who had done everything correctly, and that what had happened to him had not been his fault. It was not restitution. It was the truth written down in the place where the lie had lived. Clara sat in the recorder's office when the final papers were signed, and she held the certified copy in both hands, and Ethan did not say anything, and Prescott did not say anything, and the recorder, who had no particular stake in any of this, emotionally asked if she needed a moment. "No," she said. "Thank you." She stood. She walked outside. She stood in the street in the place where she had grown up, and she held her father's corrected record against her chest for 1 full minute alone with it, because it was hers, and she needed 1 minute with it before she let it become part of the larger story. Then Ethan came out and stood beside her, and she handed the document to him, and he read it the way he read everything, thoroughly, quietly, without commentary, until he'd finished. He handed it back. "Your father built something honest," he said. "The record says so now." "He did," she said. "You're like him." She looked at him. "How do you know what he was like?" "I know what you're like," Ethan said. "And you come from somewhere." She breathed through that for a moment. "I want to visit the land," she said. He nodded. "Whenever you're ready." It took her until the following morning. They hired a horse and wagon from the livery and drove out through the familiar countryside to the place where her family's farm had stood, and the house was different now. New owners' additions built, the old fence replaced. But the land itself was the land she had run across barefoot as a child, the creek in the same place, the particular slope of the eastern field unchanged. She stood at the fence line and looked at it for a long time. "I used to know every inch of this," she said. "I used to think the whole world was exactly this size." "What size is it now?" Ethan asked. She looked at him. She looked at her hand. The ring, the creek-colored stone, the gold that had been her mother's and was now hers. She looked back at the land that wasn't hers anymore and understood, standing there, that it had never stopped being part of her. It had made her. The loss of it had made her. The woman who picked wages up out of the dirt had been assembled piece by piece out of everything that had happened on this land, and because of this land, and she could be furious about that. She was sometimes still, but she was also honestly someone she was not entirely uninterested in being. "Bigger than I thought," she said, "and smaller than I was afraid of." He stood beside her while she looked. He did not fill the quiet. He was extraordinarily good at not filling quiet. After a while, she turned away from the fence line. "All right," she said. "Let's go home." They were married in October in the church in Willow Creek on a Saturday morning when the cottonwoods had gone gold, and the air had the particular sharp clarity of a territory autumn. The ceremony was small because Clara had requested small. And what Clara requested generally happened, a principle that was becoming well established in Willow Creek's understanding of the new arrangement at the Callahan Ranch. Ruth Calloway cried from the second pew with the complete lack of self-consciousness of a woman who had been right about something for months and was not going to pretend otherwise. Holt the foreman stood in the back with his hat in his hands, and the expression of a man who had revised his opinion of a situation and found the revision satisfactory. Margaret Aldridge attended. Clara had not expected that. She came alone, sat near the back, and left before the reception without speaking to either of them. Clara saw her go, and she thought about the coins placed deliberately in her hand in the auction square. And she thought about the specific courage it required for a woman who had never once admitted she was wrong to attend the wedding of the woman she'd tried to discourage. She filed it in the category of things that were more complicated than they appeared. The reception was held at the ranch, which was the first time most of Willow Creek had a reason to come to the Callahan property as guests, rather than hired hands or business associates. Clara had organized the food herself, not because she had to, but because she was Clara Whitfield, and she organized things, and she had arranged it on the long tables in the yard, with the straightforward practicality of someone who believed that hospitality meant feeding people well and not making them feel observed while they ate. At some point during the reception, when the fiddle music was going and the children had appropriated the corner of the yard for some game that involved a great deal of running, Clara found herself standing alone at the edge of the gathering for a moment, holding a cup of cider and looking at the accumulated fact of her life as it currently stood. She had a husband. She had a ranch. She had in the pocket of her wedding dress, because she had sewn it there, specifically the certified copy of her father's corrected county record, because she intended to frame it, and she wasn't putting it in checked luggage. She had in the 6 weeks between their return from Holt County and today drafted a proposal for what she was calling internally, not publicly, yet the Whitfield Workroom, a cooperative arrangement by which women in the surrounding area who had sewing skills and needed income could work together under a shared structure with shared costs and shared revenue, and the particular kind of independence that came from owning a piece of something, rather than selling your labor to someone who owned all of it. She had presented this proposal to Ethan over coffee one Thursday morning. 9 pages of closely written documentation with projected costs and a realistic revenue model and 3 contingency structures. He had read all 9 pages. He had asked 6 specific, useful questions. He had said at the end, "The contingency structure for winter months is the weakest section. I have an idea about the cattle auction calendar that might address the timing issue. Do you want to hear it?" She had said yes. They had spent 3 hours on it. She was thinking about the particular texture of that morning. The coffee going cold again. The pages spread across the table. The specific pleasure of a problem being solved by 2 people who were genuinely good at solving problems when Ethan found her at the edge of the reception. He stood beside her. He looked at the gathering. "You look like you're planning something," he said. "I'm planning several things," she said. "The workroom, among others." He was quiet for a moment. "Ruth told me you turned down 3 new dressmaking commissions this week to work on the proposal." "The proposal takes precedence," she said. "The dressmaking will still be there." "I know," he said. "I'm not objecting, I'm observing." He turned to look at her directly. "You know you don't have to do this alone anymore. The planning, all of it." She looked at him. "I know that. You still plan like you do," he said. It was not a criticism, just a precise observation from a man who had been paying close attention for months. "Old habits," she said. "Some habits are worth keeping," he said. "Some of them kept you alive when you needed them to." He paused. "But some of them are going to cost you more than they're worth now, and I'd like to be useful where I can." Clara looked at him. This man who had sat in her shop chair and learned her jaw-pressing expression and carried both bags to Holt County and stood beside her at a fence line while she looked at land that wasn't hers anymore, and she felt in the way she felt most important things very clearly and without any ambiguity. "You are useful," she said. "You are specifically and practically useful in ways I find difficult to exaggerate." She held his gaze. The proposal has a section on partnership structure. You should read it. I've read it, he said. 3 times. She blinked. I only gave it to you once. You left it on the table, he said. I read it while you were in the shop. 3 times, she said. The revenue projections in Section 5 are ambitious, he said. I think they're right, but I want to understand your assumptions. I have notes. Clara stared at him. She had spent 4 years building a self-sufficient fortress of one, and she was standing in the yard of a ranch that was now also hers, wearing a ring that fit next to a man who had read her business proposal 3 times and taken notes, and the fortress was still there. She could feel it, the shape of it, the familiar weight, but it was no longer a prison. It was a foundation. Something she had built to survive that she was now building on top of. Show me the notes, she said. He reached into his jacket and produced a folded piece of paper. She took it. She unfolded it. She read it. Your note on the winter pricing model is correct, she said. I undercalculated the thread supply variance. I thought so, he said. Don't be smug about it. I'm never smug, he said with the complete absence of smug that was in itself slightly smug. She folded the notes and put them in the pocket of her wedding dress next to her father's record. 2 pieces of paper. One saying what had been taken from her family. One saying what she was building. The fiddle music went on. The cottonwoods moved in the autumn wind. Willow Creek danced in her yard, imperfect and ordinary and real, and Clara Callahan. Whitfield, still in the shop in the work, because she was the same person in both places, stood at the edge of it all, and understood with the particular clarity of someone who had done the accounting very carefully that what she had now was not what she had lost. It was different. It was more complicated and more uncertain, and it required more of her than safety had ever required. It was also, and she would not minimize this, the thing she had not let herself want for 4 years. Ethan touched her hand. She turned. Dance with me, he said. She looked at him. She looked at the yard full of Willow Creek watching. She thought about 11 days with a note in her apron pocket. She thought about a blue dress worn 9 times. She thought about coins in the dirt and coins placed back deliberately and a fence line in Holt County and 9 pages of business proposal and 3 careful readings and notes in a jacket pocket. Yes, she said. He led her onto the grass, and they danced in the October light while the town watched, and for the first time since she was 17 years old, Clara Whitfield did not calculate the cost of being seen. The Whitfield workroom opened on the first Monday of March 1883. Clara had chosen March deliberately, not spring exactly, not yet, but the month that pointed toward it, the month when the territory started remembering that it was capable of something other than cold. She had spent 4 months building it from the 9-page proposal into something real, a cooperative structure with 6 founding members, a shared revenue model, a pricing system that neither discounted nor inflated, and a set of written principles posted on the wall above the main work table that began with the sentence, "This work belongs to the people who do it." She had written that sentence 3 times before she was satisfied with it. Ethan had read it over her shoulder on the second draft and said nothing, which meant he thought it was right. The founding members were women Clara had identified over the course of the previous year with the particular attention she paid to things that mattered. There was Dorothy Marsh, whose husband had died of fever the previous spring and who had been taking in laundry for 9 months because it was the only income available to her. There was young Ida Reeves, 17 years old, and recently arrived from Kansas with a widowed mother and a talent for embroidery that was genuinely exceptional. There was Pearl Washington, who had been doing alterations out of her kitchen for 6 years and had never once been paid what her work was worth, because she had never had the leverage of a formal structure behind her. And there were 3 others, each of whom had come to Clara through different paths, and each of whom Clara had watched for months before approaching, because she was Clara Whitfield, and she did not do things without being sure. The morning of the opening, she stood in the workroom, a proper space. Now, not her former single-room shop, but the expanded premises 2 doors down that Ethan had negotiated a long-term lease on in November, with the particular efficient directness he applied to things Clara needed done without her having to manage the doing of them. and she looked at the 6 women taking their places at the long work tables, and she felt something in her chest that she had not felt in a very long time. Not pride exactly. Something quieter than pride. The particular satisfaction of a thing built correctly from the foundation up by someone who understood what it needed to last. Clara, Ida said from her place at the embroidery station. She was nervous. Clara could see it in the way she was aligning her thread spools with excessive precision. What if people don't come? People will come, Clara said. They have sewing that needs doing, and we do it well. Those are the only 2 variables that matter. What if they come and they think it's... Ida hesitated. Strange. A workshop run by women without a man's name on the door. Clara looked at her. There is a man's name on the door, she said. Mine. Whitfield is my father's name. He was a good man who built something honest and had it taken from him by someone who counted on the fact that nobody would check his work. She held Ida's gaze steadily. I check my work. So does everyone in this room. That is the only credential this place needs. Ida looked at the thread spools. She straightened the last one. All right, she said. Besides, Dorothy said from across the room, without looking up from the fabric she was cutting, half the town already knows what this place is. Ruth Calloway has been talking about it since November. Ruth talks about everything, Pearl said. Ruth talks about everything accurately, Clara said, which is why people listen to her. The door opened at 8 o'clock, and the first customer was Margaret Aldridge. Clara looked at her across the room and did not let her expression do anything complicated. Margaret Aldridge looked back at Clara with the expression of a woman who had made a decision and was not going to make a production of it. I need a winter coat remade, Margaret said. The lining is deteriorating and the collar needs modernizing. I was told this establishment handles complex alterations. We do, Clara said. Pearl handles coat work. She'll take your measurements and give you a timeline and a price. Margaret looked at Pearl. She looked back at Clara. Something passed across her face that was not quite an apology and not quite anything else, but had the shape of both. Thank you, she said. Of course, Clara said. Pearl took Margaret Aldridge's measurements with the practiced efficiency of 6 years of kitchen table alterations and quoted her a fair price, and Margaret paid the deposit without argument. After she left, Dorothy caught Clara's eye from across the room. Well, Dorothy said. Well, Clara agreed. They went back to work. The workroom was profitable within its first 2 months, which was ahead of Clara's most optimistic projection, and which she reported to Ethan on a Thursday evening with a restraint that lasted approximately 30 seconds before she let him see how satisfied she actually was. Section 5, he said. The revenue projections you thought were ambitious. Were correct, she said. Yes. I told you they were right. You told me they were ambitious, and you thought they were right, she said. There's a distinction. Is there, professionally speaking? He was smiling at her in the particular way that he had the one that was still technically almost a smile, but had evolved over the months of their marriage considerably closer to an actual one. Write it into the second quarter report, he said. That projections were met ahead of schedule. I already did, she said. He laughed. It was a good sound. She had been collecting the specific frequency of it since October, and was not going to say so. The ranch itself had changed since October, in ways that were quieter, but no less real. Clara had not set out to change it. She had specifically, deliberately, not set out to change it. Understanding that walking into a man's established household and immediately rearranging it was a particular kind of disrespect she wasn't interested in performing. She had watched first. She had learned how the place worked, its rhythms, its needs, the places where things were working well, and the places where they were being held together by habit rather than function. And then gradually she had begun to say things. The first thing she said was about the account books. Ethan kept them himself, which was reasonable, but he kept them in a system that had evolved organically from his father's system, which had evolved from his grandfather's system, which had been invented by a man who had been tracking 40 head of cattle and had not anticipated a ranch that now ran over 400. Clara spent 3 evenings with the books, said nothing during those 3 evenings, and on the fourth evening presented Ethan with a restructured ledger system and a 3-year projection model that could actually be used to make decisions rather than simply record them. He looked at it for the long time. "This would have saved me approximately 40 hours a year," he said. "Approximately," she agreed. "How long did this take you?" 3 evenings. He looked at her. "Why didn't you tell me it was inefficient?" "I hadn't earned the right to say so yet," she said. "I needed to understand how it worked before I could say how it could work better. Criticizing before understanding is just noise." He was quiet for a moment. "Who taught you that?" "My father," she said. "He said the most expensive thing a person could do was speak before they understood the problem." "He was right," Ethan said. "He was about most things," she said. The things that weren't his fault were the exceptions. Holt had come around by November, which Clara had expected would take until at least January, and which she attributed not to any particular effort on her part, but to the simple mechanics of competence over time. He was a practical man. Practical men could be argued with by performance better than by persuasion. And Clara's performance over the first 2 months of her presence at the ranch had been consistent enough that his concerns had eventually run out of specific examples to attach themselves to. He came to her in November with a problem about feed costs, specifically a supplier in the eastern county who had raised his prices 3 months in a row in a way that Holt found suspicious but couldn't articulate clearly enough to take to Ethan. He came to Clara because Ethan was riding fence, and because Clara was sitting at the kitchen table with the account books, and because Holt would admit to himself later he had started to understand that she was the kind of person who could read numbers the way he could read cattle. Not with effort, but with the particular comprehension of someone for whom the information was a language rather than a task. Clara looked at the feed invoices for 15 minutes. Then she said, "He's increasing by 7% every quarter. That's not market fluctuation. Market prices don't move that regularly. That's deliberate. He's testing how much you'll absorb before you change suppliers." Holt looked at her. "How do you know?" "I've seen it done to small businesses," she said. "The increment is small enough each time that it doesn't trigger alarm. But compounded over a year, it's a 28% increase, and there's no commodity movement in feed corn that accounts for that." She looked up at him. "There's a supplier in the western county that Ethan hasn't worked with. I've seen his price sheets. He's consistent and his quality reviews are good. It would mean a longer haul, but the cost difference would cover the transport difference inside the first quarter." Holt was quiet for a moment. "I'll bring it to Ethan," he said. "You should bring it to Ethan," she agreed. "It's your recommendation to make." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't categorize immediately, and then recognized as respect of the specific, unglamorous variety, the kind that had been earned incrementally, and that meant more than the other kind precisely because of that. "Mrs. Callahan," he said. "Holt," she said. After that he came to her sometimes before Ethan. Not often, but sometimes, and always with the same implicit understanding. Her analysis was hers to give, his recommendation was his to make, and Ethan's decision was Ethan's to reach. The division of that process was something all 3 of them understood without needing to document it, which Clara found considerably more satisfying than most formal arrangements. The letter came in April. It arrived addressed to Clara, not to Ethan, not to Mr. and Mrs. Callahan, but to Clara Whitfield. Callahan, specifically, which told her something about who had sent it before she opened it. She opened it at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning with her coffee alone, because Ethan was out early and she had the particular Tuesday morning quiet that she still 6 months into the marriage treasured with the guilty pleasure of a woman who loved her husband and also loved the specific silence before the world started asking things of her. It was from Eleanor Hargrave. She read it once. She read it again. She set it on the table and sat with it for a moment. Then she picked it up and read the important part a 3rd time. "I am writing because I want to say something that I was not capable of saying clearly when we were in the same territory." What Ethan did, the directness of it, the honesty was initially painful in the way that honest things sometimes are when we have been expecting something different. But it was also, and I understood this only later, a profound courtesy. He treated me as someone capable of handling truth, which is a thing not all men think women are capable of. I have spent the months since thinking about what it means to be chosen by a man who is actually offering himself rather than fulfilling an obligation. And I have concluded that it means everything, and that I would rather wait for that than accept the other kind. I am also writing because I want you to know that my father's anger has not persisted in the same form. He is a man who requires time to revise his position, but he is also at his core an honest man, and honest men eventually arrive at honest assessments. He has told me recently that he believes your husband acted with integrity, and that is the closest my father comes to an apology for his behavior, and I think you should have that information. I hope you are well. I hope the ranch is everything it should be. And I hope that whoever you are, Clara Callahan, you are exactly as much of yourself as possible. Eleanor Hargrave. Clara folded the letter. She sat with it until she heard Ethan's boots on the porch step, and then she stood and poured him a cup of coffee and set it on the table, and when he came in and sat down, she handed him the letter without comment. He read it. He set it down. Eleanor Hargrave is a remarkable woman, he said. She is, Clara agreed. I think she would have been miserable married to you. He looked at her. Not because of any deficiency in either of you, Clara said. Because you're both too honest for a relationship built on obligation to have survived comfortably. It would have been technically functional and privately difficult, and you both would have been too principled to say so. Ethan considered this. Probably accurate, he said. Definitely accurate, Clara said. Drink your coffee. He drank his coffee. While it was still warm, she noted this with private satisfaction. Write her back, he said. Already planning it, Clara said. The twist came in June, and it came from a direction Clara had not anticipated, which was itself notable. She anticipated most things. A man arrived in Willow Creek on a Wednesday afternoon and went directly to the county recorder's office, and what he was looking for was documentation related to the original Callahan land grant. Not Ethan's land, the original grant the one. Ethan's grandfather had filed in 1847 before Montana was a territory, and when the land designation system had been considerably less organized than it later became. The man's name was Garrett Cole, and he represented a railroad company out of Chicago, and what he told Ethan in the meeting that Ethan came home from on Wednesday evening with the particular tight expression that Clara had learned to identify as the precursor to a serious conversation, was that there was a question about a section of the original land grant that overlapped with a right-of-way corridor the railroad intended to run through the territory. Not the whole ranch. A strip of land roughly 400 yards wide and 2 miles long cutting through the northeastern section. How significant is that section? Clara asked. It's where the Northern Creek tributary runs, Ethan said. The one that feeds the summer pasture. Without that water access, the summer pasture is viable for maybe 2 months instead of 4. He set his hat on the table. It doesn't destroy the ranch, but it changes the carrying capacity significantly. What does he want? He wants the right-of-way corridor, Ethan said. The railroad will pay market value for the easement. The problem is that the original land grant has a documentation gap. There's a period in 1851 where the county records are incomplete, and Cole is arguing that the gap creates a question about whether that section was ever formally included in the Callahan holding or whether it was open territory that was simply absorbed over time. Clara was quiet for a moment. That's the same technique, she said. Ethan looked at her. A buried ambiguity, she said. Real or manufactured, it doesn't matter at the start. What matters is that it creates enough uncertainty to make you settle rather than fight. Harlan Deeds used a buried clause. This man is using a documentation gap. The mechanism is different, but the logic is the same. Find the weakness, apply pressure at the weakness, and see if the other party would rather pay to make it go away than spend the money and time to prove it isn't real. Ethan looked at her steadily. You think the gap is manufactured. I think that railroad companies have legal departments whose entire function is to find or create gaps in land documentation in territories where the original records are incomplete, she said. I think that a man who shows up on a Wednesday afternoon and wants to talk settlement by Friday has a timeline that serves the railroad and not you. And I think that you should not speak to Garrett Cole again until you have someone who has read every document in the original Callahan filing. That's going to take a time, Ethan said. How much time does the railroad have? She said. Cole said they need the right-of-way decision by end of summer for the construction timeline. Then you have until end of summer, Clara said. That's enough time. She was already thinking. He could see it, the jaw, the focused sequential expression, the way her hands had gone flat on the table. Clara, he said, I'll get the lawyer. Yes, she said, and I want to see the original filing. It's 60 pages of frontier-era land documentation. I know what it is, she said. I want to see it. He looked at her for a long moment. I'll have it here by tomorrow morning, he said. She read it in 2 days. Not because 60 pages of 1840s land documentation was easy reading. It was approximately the opposite of easy reading, written in the cramped hand of a territorial recorder who had been processing dozens of filings a day and had not prioritized clarity, but because Clara Whitfield had learned to read contracts the way her father had not had the opportunity to learn, and she applied to the Callahan original filing. The same focused analytical attention she had given to the account books in October and the feed supplier invoices in November. She found the answer on the afternoon of the second day. Ethan, she said. He came in from the yard. She pointed to a page. The 1851 GAP that Cole is citing, she said. It's real. There is a period where the county records don't have a confirming document. But look at this. She set a second page beside the first. This is the original territorial filing from 1847. This paragraph here. The language about the water tributary sections. It designates the Northeastern Creek Corridor as a primary water resource feature of the original holding. That designation language was standard in 1847 filings because the territorial government wanted water access documented specifically. She held his gaze. The 1851 gap doesn't create a question about ownership. The 1847 designation already answered the question. Cole's legal team is arguing that the absence of a confirming document creates uncertainty, but they're ignoring the fact that the original filing already confirmed it. You can't manufacture a gap in the middle of a document when the beginning and end of the document both confirm the same thing. Ethan looked at the pages. He looked at her. You found this in 2 days, he said. My father didn't have anyone to read his contract, she said. I've been reading contracts ever since. His expression did the thing it sometimes did, the thing that was not quite pride, because it was something more personal than that something that had no clean word in the language they were both using. I'll call the lawyer, he said. Call Prescott too, she said. He knows how to read the old territorial language. He's dealt with documentation gaps before. The legal response to Garrett Cole's railroad company took 6 weeks to prepare, and when it was delivered, it was 43 pages long and documented with complete historical precision that the northeastern section of the Callahan land grant had been formally designated in the original 1847 filing, and that the 1851 gap was a record-keeping issue that created no legal ambiguity in the ownership of the water corridor. Garrett Cole left Willow Creek without a settlement. The railroad rerouted its right-of-way corridor 6 miles north. The Northern Creek tributary continued feeding the summer pasture through July and August and into September, exactly as it always had. The woman arrived on a Thursday afternoon in August, which Clara would later think was appropriate. Thursdays had always been the day when important things happened, or the day she noticed them happening, which amounted to the same thing. Clara was at the workroom. She had been there since morning. There was a large commission for a ranching family's daughter's wedding that required all 6 women working steadily, and she was reviewing the finished pieces with the focused, critical eye she applied to all finished work when Ida appeared at her elbow. Clara, Ida said quietly. There's a woman at the station. Clara looked up. A customer. I don't think so, Ida said. She came off the afternoon train. She's been sitting on the bench outside the station for 20 minutes. She has 1 bag. She doesn't look like she knows where she's going. Clara set down the piece she was reviewing. She had not been looking for this. She had not been waiting for it, had not planned for it, had not anticipated it as part of the story she was living. But when Ida described it, she felt something in her chest move with the immediate recognition of a woman who had once sat at a train station in a different town with $14 and the specific quality of fear that came from being somewhere new with no clear path forward. "Finish the hem review," she said to Ida. "I'll be back." She walked to the station. The woman on the bench was perhaps 20 years old, with dark hair pinned back imprecisely under a travel-worn hat, and the particular rigid posture of someone using physical stillness to prevent themselves from falling apart. Her bag was small, the kind of small that meant it contained everything she had, not a selection from a larger wardrobe. Her hands were folded in her lap with a tightness that Clara recognized as the specific grip of someone holding themselves together by force. She sat down on the bench beside her. The woman looked up. Her eyes were the reddened, overly clear eyes of someone who had been crying recently and had stopped and was managing the aftermath with everything she had. "I'm Clara Callahan," Clara said. "I run the dress and alterations shop 2 streets over. I saw you come off the train." The woman looked at her warily. I don't need charity." "I know," Clara said. "I didn't offer any." A pause. "My name is Violet," the woman said. "Violet Cross." "Where are you coming from, "Nebraska," Violet said. I had a situation there that I needed to leave." Clara did not ask what the situation was. "Do you have somewhere to stay?" "Not yet," Violet said. "I had a woman who was supposed to meet me, but she wasn't here. I sent a letter, but I don't know if she received it." "Ruth Calloway runs the boarding house on 4th Street, Clara said. "She has a room that's been empty since March. It's clean, and the rate is fair, and she doesn't ask questions before she knows you well enough to ask good ones." Violet looked at her. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I know what it looks like," Clara said, "to sit at a station in a town you've never been to and try to calculate whether the ground is going to hold." Violet's carefully managed composure did something around the edges. Not breaking, not quite, but showing in the way a thing under pressure shows before it gives. "Does it?" Violet said. Her voice was controlled and precise, and slightly too controlled, which meant it was working hard. "Does the ground hold?" Clara thought about $14 and a sewing kit. She thought about coins in the dirt and a note in a tin box. She thought about Prescott's records and her father's name corrected in the county documents and a ring that fit and a man who read her proposals 3 times and took notes. She thought about 6 women at work tables and a principal written on the wall and a railroad company that had rerouted 6 miles north because someone had read the original documents correctly. She thought about every choice she had made, the ones that had kept her alive when she needed them to, and the ones she had finally stopped being afraid to make. "It holds," she said. "Not always evenly, not always without cost, but it holds." Violet looked at her for a long moment. "Can I?" She stopped, tried again. "Is there work here, real work, not charity?" "There's a cooperative workroom," Clara said. "We take on new members when they can demonstrate skill and commitment. The pay is fair, and the structure is honest, and nobody owns your labor but you." She paused. "Can you sew?" "My grandmother taught me," Violet said. "She said a woman who could sew could always make something from nothing." "Your grandmother was right," Clara said. "Come and I'll show you the space. You can decide if it suits you." Violet picked up her bag. She stood. She was taller than she'd looked sitting down with the particular straightness of someone who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had not let it curve her spine. "Why are you doing this?" she said. Not suspiciously, just asking plainly the way someone asked when they had learned that kindness without a visible reason was something to understand rather than simply accept. Clara looked at her. She thought about all the answers she could give, the true ones, the specific ones, the ones that would take a long time to tell properly. "Because someone built a room with a work table in it and a chair by the window," she said, "and let me sit at it long enough to figure out I didn't have to do everything alone." She picked up her own bag. "I'm doing the same thing. Come on." They walked together down the main street of Willow Creek, 2 women who had arrived at this town with almost nothing and everything required, and the town continued around them in its ordinary way. The dry goods store, the hardware, the church with the leaking hall, the auction square where something important had happened in September, and Clara walked through it the way she had learned to walk through everything, not without feeling it, but without letting it determine her direction. Ethan was on the porch when she came home that evening, reading the newspaper and drinking coffee, warm coffee. She had noticed this had become a habit, whether through her influence or simple age, she couldn't say, and he looked up when she came up the steps and read her expression immediately. "Good day," he said. "Yes," she said. She sat beside him. "There's a young woman named Violet Cross at Ruth's boarding house. She came on the afternoon train. I've offered her a trial at the workroom." Ethan set down the paper. "Nebraska." "Nebraska," she said. "What's her situation?" "Hers to tell when she's ready," Clara said. "Right now she needs a bed and a fair wage and time to find the ground steady." He looked at her for a moment. "Is she going to be all right?" Clara thought about it honestly. "I think so," she said. "She's frightened, but she's not broken. And she doesn't want charity, which means she has the kind of pride that can be worked with." She paused. "She reminds me of someone." Ethan reached over and took her hand. He held it the way he held most things, carefully, without making a performance of it, with the simple steadiness of someone who intended to keep holding it. "You're building something," he said. It was not a question. "I've been building something since March," she said. "I mean the larger thing," he said. She knew what he meant. She had known it since the morning she looked at 6 women at work tables and understood that what she was doing was not simply running a business. It was demonstrating one careful, practical example at a time that the world could be arranged differently than it currently was, and that the rearrangement did not require permission from anyone who had benefited from the original arrangement. "Yes," she said. "Good," he said. They sat on the porch in the August evening, and the light came down the way it did in summer, long and golden and honest, without any attempt to make things look different than they were. And Clara thought about her father, who had built something honest and had it taken, and about the county record that now said so, and about the name on the wall of the workroom, and about Violet Cross, who would walk through that door tomorrow morning and find a room where the work belonged to the people who did it. She thought about all the versions of herself that had been required to get here, the version that picked wages up from the dirt, the version that burned a note and kept it anyway, the version that read 60 pages of territorial documentation in 2 days because her father hadn't had anyone to read his contracts for him. She thought every single one of them was necessary. She thought, and none of them had to be the last one. Ethan squeezed her hand. She squeezed back. And the woman who had arrived in Willow Creek with $14 and the conviction that she could not afford to need anything from anyone, sat on her porch in the summer light and understood with the complete and documented precision of someone who had checked the math from every angle, that what she had built was not luck, was not rescue, was not the story anyone in this town had expected from a seamstress with no family name and mud-stained coins. It was the life she had made with the hands she had out of the materials available with the partner she had chosen for the reasons she had decided were worth choosing. No one had given it to her. She had built every inch of it herself, and that more than any other fact she had accumulated in her 30 years was the one she intended to keep.